I find the story of how Norris Bradbury came to Los Alamos rather interesting. He was a graduate student at the University of California in the 30s, and every student who was a graduate student of Professor Loeb had to join the Navy Reserve. So when the war started, all these scientists were activated into the Navy, and about 4 PhDs ended up at the Naval Proving Ground in Virginia. And the commandant of the proving ground was not he was a retired naval officer who'd been passed over, and he came back, and he was called back because of the war. And so he had all these PhDs that he didn't know what to do with, but Norris was doing a very good job there. And Captain Parsons was at the proving ground, and when Groves decided they needed a ballistics specialist to study the ballistic characteristics of the bomb and design the bomb and have the plane capable of carrying the bomb, Parsons was asked to come to Los Alamos. And once Parsons got here, he asked Norris Bradbury to come. And as everyone knows, when Oppenheimer left, they asked Norris to become director, and Norris said, well, I'd really rather go back to Stanford and resume my teaching position, but I'll stay for a few months. And Norris stayed for 25 years, and I think the laboratory was very lucky to have him.
Do me a favor. Speak to Cindy instead of the camera.
All right. Well, I'm just sort of, I can barely see. Now, when I was showing the house where we lived to someone, to a group several years ago, they asked if Oppenheimer, when they had parties at the Oppenheimer home, did they discuss scientific items? And I said I really didn't know, but then I asked. Later, I asked someone who knew, and I can't remember who it was, and they said, oh, yes, we did. Oppie would look around and say, I now declare this a secure area, and then they would start discussing their problems, which is very logical because the whole town was secure. Now, backing up a little further in time, one morning, in early days, in the summer, Los Alamos went on daylight saving. This is in the 50s. Los Alamos went on daylight saving time, and the rest of the state did not go on daylight saving time. But the laboratory wanted to stay with the only 2-hour difference with Washington. And the opera had started. I'd gone to the opera for 2 nights in a row, and as you realize, the opera started at 10 o'clock our time. We got home very late. So I went out one Sunday morning to pick up the Sunday paper, and someone was walking by and said, I used to live in that house. And it was Anita Waring. She and her husband, he had been a tutor at the school, lived in the house in the 30s. So I naturally said, come in and tell me all about it. And I learned several rather interesting things. I never understood why the master houses, the only one that had a dining room was Peggy Pond Church's house, and they had built it themselves. But the Miss Anita Waring said, oh, but we always took all our meals with the boys because we were expected to have meals with the boys. And the only thing I used my kitchen for was woodworking. She had grown up in Santa Fe. She'd actually been in Mrs. Pond's the first Girl Scout troop in Santa Fe. Anita Waring had been in this Girl Scout troop, and she'd grown up in a old adobe house between La Fonda Hotel and the cathedral. When I came, that house had become a Indian store, curio shop. And then I asked about the heating bit. Well, Mr. Cano, the director of the school, did not like coal. He thought coal was a very bad way of heating. So all the houses were heated with wood, except the cook at the lodge said, I'm not cooking for 60 or 70 people on a wood stove, so she got coal. And that's about it. Anything else, you have to ask me a few questions. What have I forgotten?
Oh, my. What more can you tell us about the Manhattan Project?
Oh, well, when the Oppenheimers, our house was built for, the house that we're in and in which Oppenheimer lived was built for May Connell. She was the sister of the director of the school, and he felt that young boys could be raised best by men, but he realized maybe they needed a little bit of a woman's influence. So he asked his sister to come. She evidently was the first one that said, "I'd like a stone house. I don't want a log house." And so they built the house for her, and it has an extremely nice living room because she was an artist. She had studied in Europe, and so they built the living room as a combination living room, dining room, and art studio. And the house was quite small when the Oppenheimers moved into it. There was the nice large living room, the kitchen, a bathroom, a small study, and a sleeping porch. All the masters' houses had sleeping porches, but they got radiators. The boys did not get radiators on their sleeping porches. Their sleeping porches were open, but the masters got radiators and windows so they could close it off when it was snowing. Well, the Oppenheimers wanted a dining room. Mrs. Oppenheimer thought it would be nice to have a dining room. So during the war years, the kitchen was added, and the original dining room was turned into the kitchen was added, and the original kitchen was changed into a dining room. And then at the end of the war, the Jettys moved into the house, and they had a young son, and so the bedroom and the bathroom arrangement was changed. But it's still a rather small house with a large, very nice living room. Anything else?
Well, in the way when the house was, as the Oppenheimers lived in it, the children slept in the.
Well, they had only one child at that. I think Peter, the older child had been born, but the second child hadn't been born yet. But I assume when the BBC came and then made the television film in the matter of Robert Oppenheimer, they asked me where everybody slept, and I of course did not know, but I assume that they put the baby in the sleeping porch and they slept in the study. But since Oppie spent most of his time at the laboratory, it probably worked out quite adequately. And when the Parsons came, Martha Parsons was used to entertaining large groups, and Kitty Oppenheimer did not care for entertaining large groups. So Martha Parsons took care of all the sort of formal entertaining that had to be done with visitors. They were in the house. The Parsons lived in the house that Peggy Pond Church and her husband had built, which was across the street. The two-story house, the only two-story home. And that was the one that had a dining room because they ended up with 3 children. They started out with a small house and then enlarged it, and so they ended up with a dining room because they had 3 small children. Oh, and an interesting thing about the Warings, they decided that they would start a younger school down in Nam-Bay, which would feed to the Los Alamos Ranch School. And they did this, maybe a year or two before the Army came in. And so, of course, that wasn't very successful. And we all think that the laboratory really started in 43, but the Army came in 42 and started doing construction in the late fall. So and then there's, of course, the story of Sterling Colgate. Someone said this can't be right, but Sterling likes the story. When Oppenheimer and Groves came up to inspect the school, they sort of drove in rather quickly and drove out. And then the boys were told that the school would be closing, and it was all very hush-hush. And Sterling said, "Oh, well, I know what it is. I recognize that pork pie hat of Oppenheimer, so I know what's going." And this is another funny story, which is not quite Manhattan Project. Sterling graduated in the last class at the school, which was 1943 in January, and he went to Cornell until he was 18, and then he joined the Merchant Marines, and he was on a ship in the South Pacific. And, of course, the draft board wanted to know where he was, and they got in touch with his father and said, "Why hasn't Sterling reported to the draft board?" And his father said, "Well, he's out in the South Pacific. If you can find him, that's quite all right with us." And at the time of the drop of the bomb on Japan, he was on a Dutch freighter. And he said absolutely no one on that freighter knew a thing about electricity, so he became what they call the sparks. He was in charge of everything that was electric on the ship, and realized he was 19 or 20 at the time. And when the captain announced to the crew that the war was over because a bomb had been dropped on Japan, he added the comment, "And Mr. Colgate will explain it all to you." And Sterling said he didn't even know the captain knew who he was.
Wow,
I think that's a nice story.
great story. Wow. Well, tell some more.
Well, I don't know if I know anymore. I hope you can edit these things.
You said you came here in 47?
Yes.
So, and
Oh, well, well, all right. When we came in 47, we got here in August. So, of course, this really isn't very good for the Manhattan Project. But the last night we spent in Raton, and we thought, well, Raton's a small town. We won't have any trouble finding a place to stay. They were having horse races. We ended up staying in something strange over a drugstore because the place was packed. And then, of course, the next morning we drove to Santa Fe, checked in with Dorothy McKibben, and then came on up to the hill. And we stayed in the big house. The western area, they started building the western area in 1946, and they started on the Trinity side and went up and around the curve. And we had a house assigned to us off of Sandia. Do I have that straight? I hope. I think so. But anyway, we had a house assigned to us, and it wasn't going to be ready for a few weeks. And we were on the third floor of the big house, which was the boys' dormitory. And in the old days, it was now being used for visitors. And so we stayed there for 6 weeks. They offered us an apartment, but I thought, heavenly days, to unpack everything that's been packed and then repack and move into the house in the western area would be a chore. And I asked my husband to find out what colors they were painting the inside of the house. Well, it turned out they were painting the walls cream and the trim green, which to me did not appeal whatsoever. So Jerry went back and suggested that they paint the trim cream too. I don't know. Architects should hire women when they start doing the interior designs. And we, the floors, the western area floors were evidently reused flooring, which was nice because they were nice wood floors. But the company was not refinishing them, so we had to borrow a polisher and went through about a ton of rags waxing the floors. What else? And then the League of Women Voters got involved. The League actually got involved before that. I didn't know this, but there are two models of the western area houses in the downtown area on Ponderosa. I think that I may have that wrong, but they were samples. And when they designed those houses, they decided they'd put all the core utilities together. So the sink was on the inside of the kitchen, the interior of the kitchen wall, instead of underneath the window. They had cabinets under the window, and the window was a little high. So the League of Women Voters looked at those and said, really, I don't think this is a very good design. You should put the sink underneath the window and extend your pipes a little bit. And then the first winter or the second winter we were here, the gas line still came from Albuquerque. And we had a very bad cold spell. It wasn't as bad as the cold spell in the 70s, but it was quite cold and the gas went off. When we did have fireplaces, so Zia would come out every morning, toss out a load of wood, and then we'd all dash out and get the wood and have some heat in the house, roughly speaking. It was not as bad as the cold snap in the 70s, where we went down to 30 below and the valley went down to 40 below. But by that time, we had gas, since the gas line came from Farmington over the mountains, and it was the people in Santa Fe who suffered rather than Los Alamos. But originally the gas line had come through Albuquerque and up to us. And they'd cut, in the 40s, they had to cut it off to us because they couldn't keep up the pressure. And in the 70s, they cut it off north of what is called the Federal Oval, or where the post office is in Santa Fe. They'd cut it off north of that because they couldn't keep up the pressure. So everybody north of the Federal Oval had no gas. Anything else?
Cindy?
Okay,
I need a Kleenex.
well, it's a shame, we're really trying to focus on the Manhattan.
Yes, I
Project.
know. But I told you, well, we didn't come to 47. And I don't think I should tell you things that I've read. Oh, thank you. Hay fever. I don't think I should tell you things I read. Although a lot of people haven't read much about Parsons. And Parsons was a very bright person. There's a very interesting book about Parsons. He was born in Chicago but raised in New Mexico, in southern New Mexico. And his mother was determined that all the children, his father was a lawyer who decided he didn't want to raise the children in Chicago. He came out first with rented a boxcar, loaded it up. This was in early 1910s probably in 1900 something or other, but loaded up the boxcar with the horse, the cow, the carriage, and the household effects, settled at near Roswell, and then the family came out and joined him. And Deke Parsons had decided he wanted to go to the Naval Academy, and he was only 16. He went for his physical, and they said, "You're too short." And he said, "But I'm only 16." And they took him, and he grew to be 6 foot something or other. And he was a very intelligent and bright person, because he had worked with the proximity fuse, which was why he was at Dahlgren. This is where they were testing the proximity fuse. And after he had taken it out to the Pacific, to get you always had to convince the gunners that this is better than what they were using. He came back to Dahlgren and then was asked to come to Los Alamos. And an interesting side bit of this, Admiral King was in charge of the proximity fuse, and they wanted to use it in Europe towards the end of the war. They were perfectly happy to use it in the Pacific, because if it fell anywhere, it would fall in the water and the enemy wouldn't be able to get it. Well, King wouldn't release it for a long time in the European field, because he said, well, they'll get it and then they'll copy it. Well, someone finally convinced Admiral King that the war was almost over and it would be a great help to the Army, so they finally got it. But then I'm reading a book on radar. And as someone said, it was radar that won the war and the bomb ended it, which is really quite true. And I know you want the Manhattan Project, but I'm now repeating things that I've read.
That's fair game, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
Was there some residual attitude? In 47, the Manhattan Project was a success. Was there some residual sort of attitude about it? Did it infuse some sort of a,
Well, you see, we came from a Navy station. And at that time, as soon as the war was over, most of the people here wanted to go back to where they were. They were from university or industry or someplace. And so, but Norris couldn't start hiring until the McMahon Act was passed. And once he knew the laboratory was going to stay, then he started hiring. And he came to Dahlgren and invited 3 people to come for interviews, and my husband and a friend came out for interviews, and my husband came for the job. He'd been working as an electrical engineer during the war, and Norris thought he was an electrical engineer, but when he came out for an interview, he explained to Norris he was really a theoretical physicist, and he really would like to do that, and so that's how we ended up here. And we haven't left since. But I don't know. You see, I must admit that I used to go back to Washington quite often, and in the early days when I would go to a store and buy something and send it. When I said Los Alamos, I always sort of cringed, but no one seemed to notice. So I don't know whether it would what the attitude was. And then, this is so far apart, but my husband spent some time working in England, and he flew over, and I took the Queen, one of the Queens, and we were still, this was in the 50s, and we were still very security-minded. And at that time, the British had an immigration officer aboard the ship. So you went through customs and immigration before you got off the ship. So the man looked at my passport, and he kept saying, well, are you going to get a job? And I kept saying, no, I'm meeting my husband. But I couldn't say he's working for the British Atomic Energy because I didn't think I was supposed to say that. And he didn't. People don't associate Los Alamos, the name Los Alamos, even in the 50s. So he finally decided to let me ashore. Though I thought it was funny. But we were quite security minded. And if you knew what was going on, it was mostly by osmosis, is all I can say.
How long was the town a gated town?
It was gated until the laboratory opened on South Mesa. And we moved downtown in 56, and Jerry could walk to work on the other side of the pond for about a year. And then the laboratory opened on South Mesa. And of course, everybody screamed bloody murder because we were going to get invaded by all these strangers. And it was quite funny in the early days with community concerts. If we had everybody had to have passes. If someone wanted to come up to the concert from Santa Fe, they had to go to Dorothy McKibben and get a pass. And if we had a group of European group playing for the concert, they had to have security clearance to get in. So it was quite involved. And then, of course, when they sold the town, that was another interesting thing. Oh, and someone talking about the pond, the AEC really wanted to fill in the pond. And it was Jim Tuck and several other people that got up and said, no way are you filling in the pond. And so they got very active in that. AEC always wanted to sort of level everything out and make it sort of uniform. But the pond was saved, which is rather nice.
When did they decide to keep the Fuller Lodge and the Bathtub Row houses, but take down almost everything else?
I think it was done gradually, because they, when they had the push for housing, they couldn't take down like when we moved downtown in 56, the Sunts were still up. The Sunt duplexes, which were just small one-bedroom houses, and then the quads and all the temporary housing was up. That it went down as they built in North Community and in the eastern area. But the temporary housing was up for a long, long time. And that's an interesting thing. Somebody from the Sunt Company came through our little history museum and said, you don't have anything in here about the Sunt Company. And they had really done a great job in everybody had done a great job in throwing up the buildings. That was as big a project, getting the physical plant up as the laboratory running. And I understand there were sort of tricks of getting additions onto the laboratory because during the war, if it wasn't too expensive, it would just sort of went through automatically. So you did little things in pieces.
And who would build them? Would that be the responsibility?
The Army hired contractors and carpenters and this sort of thing. But then they hired the McKee houses. Were built by Robert McKee. There were something called Hanford houses that were shipped down here, but some of that could have even been done at the end of the war. And the Sunts were built by the Sunt Company, and I'm not sure where their headquarters is, but they evidently are still in business.
Someone told me that the other day.
So I think they sent some things to the History Museum so that they would have them in the archives. Because building the physical plant was as big a job as, in some ways, as getting the laboratory going.
Well, you've been terrific.
Oh, thank you.
This is perfect. I mean, we need to go on to post.
The people who lived in them, if you put your finger on the wall and it sizzled, then you sent your husband down to scrape out the coal because they got very hot. Yeah.
burning.
Oh, and the Tucks, Harold, Beverly spoke of the water shortage. Well, the Tucks, Elsie was washing dishes, and there was no water, and they were going up to Leadville to go skiing, so she didn't close off the tap. And when they got back, the place was sort of flooded.
Oh, dear.
But this is what the sort of things happen.